Welcome back to Major Religions of the West. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the sacred scriptures and then a tiny bit of theology as well, the 5 pillars of Islam. First, we're going to start with the Quran. We talked about a little bit in the history of Islam, but I want to talk a little bit more about some of the content and structure of it. Then we'll move into what's called the Hadith, and we'll talk a little bit about its content and how it came to exist. And then finally, we'll end with what's called the 5 pillars of Islam. and just kind of see a little bit about there. We'll see a little bit more theology and a little bit of Islamic practice as well. So starting first of all with the Quran. Okay. Remember that as we come to a sacred text that might be foreign to us, that it might be something that's not part of your religion or part of your religious upbringing or experience, it can be easy to come to it and try to figure out why this text is wrong, or perhaps even approach it with the mindset of, I'm going to try to show that this is evil or dangerous or something like that. Really, the mindset that we want to come to this particular religious text with here is one of understanding. Education begins with understanding first. If you don't understand it, you can't possibly determine its rightness or wrongness or any of that stuff like we talked about before. So we want to approach it and just say, what's in here, how did it come to exist, and then the debates about other particularities with the Quran for a different class. We just want to understand what's happening here. All right. So the Quran is thought by Muslims to be a direct revelation from God. Remember that Muhammad is being instructed here by the angel Gabriel, through who God is relating his divine message. And within the text, what we find is that the main speaker's voice is God, and the only time you really hear Muhammad's voice is it's usually prefaced with the command say. And so he's not talking, God's doing most of the talking. If he says something most of the time, he's being told what to say by God here. So there is no large narrative structure within the Quran itself. Doesn't look like the narrative structures, the histories, and the stories that we get from like the Old Testament or even the Hindu epics. We don't have that kind of storytelling in the Quran. Instead, what we have are 114 of what are called surahs, or individual units. You could think of them as books or chapters or whatever. They are arranged in order of length, kind of, from the longest to the shortest. Like I say, it's not exact, but that's basically the way that they're going to be outlined. The longest surah, surah number 2, has 286 verses, while the shortest surahs have just 3 verses apiece. And so you can see they're quite different in length. Every surah, except number 9, has an invocation in the name of God, most gracious and most merciful. And so all of them but that one. The earlier, shorter surahs come from the Mecca period. Remember in the last lecture we talked about how Muhammad and his followers started out in Mecca, and then they fled Mecca and went up to what was later called Medina. And that's kind of where he started his raiding and getting other converts to join this new religion. And so he wrote some there in Mecca. He got some revelations there in Mecca, and then later he's going to get more and longer revelations while he's at Medina. The shorter ones, the ones that are, it's not exactly 100% all the time that they know which surahs come from Mecca and which ones come from Medina. But, so for the most part, we'll just say here, the ones that are done in Mecca, the shorter ones, are more lyrical, and the ones that were done in Medina that are longer, they jump more from topic to topic, where the shorter ones tend to stay on topic, and usually the topic is some kind of praise or glory to God type thing. So it's a kind of a poem that's giving praise or glory to God. Think the Psalms, if you're familiar with that, and you're kind of on the right track. Hints. Okay. Each surah has a traditional name derived from its main theme. Sometimes it's the first word, or maybe it's a unique topic or something like that. So the second surah is referred to as the cow. even though it only has 6 verses that deal with the Israelites sacrificing a heifer. The entire surah is 286 verses. Only 6 of them deal with the cow, but it's still called the cow. And so that's kind of one of the things that we see in the tendencies there with the Quran. The first surah in the Quran, called the opening, encapsulates the message of Islam in just 7 verses. And so it's obviously not the longest one. That's why we say it's not necessarily longest to shortest. But in this case, it sums it up. You could say, I guess, that it's a thesis paragraph of what the rest of this book is going to be about. And so it comes first. It is cited, that surah number 1, is cited by Muslims multiple times a day as part of the 5 obligatory prayers that and conveys the news that Muhammad brought to the world, that there is but one God. So the prayer talks about the fact that there is but one God who is both merciful and just. It talks about how human beings should worship him alone and should surrender themselves. Remember, it's all about submission to the will of God. They should surrender themselves to him, following his path that he has established, and that God will help those who call upon him, but those who reject God will incur his wrath now and at the day of judgment. So those things are contained there in that first surah, and it's almost like a kind of daily reminder. And so in the Christian world, you might be familiar with the Lord's Prayer, so it'd be something kind of like that. Or in the Jewish world, if you're familiar with the Shema, it's something kind of like that. Okay. Muslims have long classified surahs as belonging either to the Meccan or to the Medinan period. Again, it's not always obvious which one it is. But it is certainly the case that this new message of monotheism would have been something very different for them than the polytheism that we talked about last time. Another startling teaching, not just that monotheistic teaching, would have been a resurrection. So within the Quran, we see Muhammad having it revealed to him that there is going to be life after death. This is going to be very new to those polytheistic nomads. They didn't think there was life after death, and so as this is being revealed, it's very new to them. It's not something that they would have been familiar with, that they would have believed previous to this new revelation. Yes, and so the surah that talks about this primarily, the surah concludes with the question of whether it's harder to believe in the resurrection than in the creation. The idea here is that if God can create humans, wouldn't God be able to then resurrect them? Wouldn't he have that power? So one of the reasons that Muhammad's going to say, yeah, I mean, resurrection is definitely something that's going to be possible for God to do. The earliest surahs are short and lyrical, as we talked about. They have a kind of a way of worshiping God's majesty and talking about God's mercy. But eventually what's going to happen is that the surahs are going to reveal more and more about what happens if you don't follow the warnings that God is giving here through his revelation, the Quran. The Quran doesn't mention a lot of the biblical stories. For example, it's not going to retell the story about Noah and the flood. Instead, what it's going to do is it's going to add something to the story, and usually the addition will have something to do with the meaning of the text. It will have something that it emphasizes it more and more. So in the Noah story case, something that it adds is that God told Noah to go and to tell the people that if they don't turn, that God will judge them, that he'll punish them, and that the people don't listen to Noah. It's not just that they don't listen to Noah, but that they stick their fingers in their ears, and that's not part of the original biblical story, right? And so there are certain things like that that are added to the stories that, again, he doesn't retell the stories from the Old Testament. He assumes that the readers are going to be familiar with those things. Yes. All right. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is mentioned frequently in the Quran with non-biblical details. Non-biblical just meaning they're not in the Bible. About her birth and her early years. In addition, the Quran has a story about Jesus making birds out of clay and bringing them to life that is found in what's called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And so within that story, Jesus is making, I'm just going to say like clay pigeons, but I don't know if it was pigeons. I'm just used to saying clay pigeons, so I always tend to say that. But imagine that you've got a child who's making something out of mud. I used to make mud pies, right? That's all I could do. But a child is making something out of mud, clay, really. And as Jesus, the child, is making these things, the birds come to life and fly. That story is found in one of the sacred texts that was rejected by Christianity called the Gospel of Thomas, but it was a story that we do see recorded now in the Quran as well. So, yeah, I mean, so not included in the original New Testament text about the life of Jesus, but it is something that was included then in the Quran. So you can see that there are pieces here and there that that look like others that are also recorded in other places as well. All right. Oh, the reason that that's okay in the mind of the Muslim believer here is that they can see and incorporate these other stories in without a problem because they believe that God was behind the other books as well. So remember that Moses and Moses and like Abraham and Noah and Jesus were prophets that the Muslims accept as legitimate. It's not that they weren't prophets, it's that their particular revelation was corrupted, and so they reject the corruption of the revelation that was given initially that was uncorrupt. And so they don't have a problem incorporating, say, the Old or pieces of the New Testament, parts they reject, obviously, but they don't have a problem with that because God's behind those books as well. And so that's why they can accept pieces and not other pieces, corruption, this part's corrupted, this part's not, right? So that's kind of the way this is working. The relationship between the Bible and the Quran is not like that of the Old and New Testament. Christians adopted the Hebrew Bible and considered it authoritative, even though parts of it have been updated or made obsolete by the revelation of Christ. Things that are made obsolete in particular, like the food laws there in the Old Testament. Christians aren't going to follow that because Jesus is the the food laws, but also like the sacrificial system, that's been outdated, it's outmoded. And so why? Because Jesus is the sacrifice that is going to cover all men, so we don't have to sacrifice sheep anymore. That's the kind of the idea here. That was the relationship of the Old and New Testament to Christians. In contrast, Muslims regard the Bible as corrupted with additions such as the idea of, so they're going to reject things specifically from the New Testament here, as God as a father, the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, the divinity of Jesus, and then also the idea of the Trinity as well. So all of those things are going to be rejected by Muslims, something that they say was added as a corruption in that scripture. The Quran is not an addition because Christians hold the Old Testament and the New Testament. You know, you've got this old covenant, that's what testament means. You've got an old covenant that was given to the Jews. You've got a new covenant that was given to the Christians through Jesus. Quran's not going to add theirs necessarily, but instead it's going to come in and replace it and say, those are corrupted, we need to get rid of them. Yeah, we can trust some of the stories that are in there, those are accurate, but the revelation is new, and this revelation is not corrupted. In general, the Quran warns the world of the evils of polytheism and idolatry, and about the need to turn to God and keep His commands before the coming day of judgment. But a few passages give special attention to Jews and Christians. It appears that early on, Muhammad views Jews as natural allies because they are monotheists, and so and they also accept that prophet that came from God, so they're going to accept them early on. But eventually, as they don't accept this new revelation, the Quran is going to have stronger words for them because they're not accepting the revelation, the uncorrupted revelation that God is giving to them through Muhammad. Nevertheless, for most of history, Muslims and Jews have gotten along fairly well. There's going to be some times not so much, but like I say, the Muslims were more tolerant in leadership as they had conquered these new societies and cultures, and so they're going to have a better relationship with the Jews there's going to be tension, but it's not as severe as the Jews have with other cultures and even Christian cultures in Europe as history unfolds as well. So, after Muhammad became the political and religious leader in Medina, he received revelations having to do with laws and regulations. These later, longer, more prosaic surahs appear toward the beginning of the Quran, and they address topics like gambling, marriage, inheritance, infanticide, property rights, criminal law, and the rights of orphans, and so forth. And so you can see it's just some of the content of the Quran. Surah number 2, the cow, is a good example. Indeed, it is sometimes regarded as the Quran in miniature because it reiterates so many of the principles that are found elsewhere in that scripture in relatively short passages. And so, kind of quickly, that Surah number 2 talks about these topics: faith, disbelief, the creation, Adam, Satan, Bible stories of Moses, the Israelites, and Jesus, polemics against Jews and Christians, Islamic practices and regulations, and more. So we see that that second one, as we said, it kind of talks about quickly, it talks about a lot of the content that is expounded upon later in the Quran. Right? The Quran organization can seem kind of like a jumble, but many Muslims believe that it's not really jumbled up, but that instead there is a pattern there. But most importantly, what we see within the Quran and its structure is that constantly the most basic message of God's grace is spread throughout the Quran, and so you can only read a few passages before you come back to this main major topic. God is merciful, but you need to be on, a just path, following God, submitting to His will, or you will suffer the consequences of God's judgment, whether that's here and now or even in eternity. So you just can't make it very far without coming back to that theme within the Quran. Some Islamic laws that are found here in the Quran. Much attention has been given to laws in the Quran regarding women. There are several that seem discriminatory by modern standards. For example, men are allowed to have 4 wives, daughters can only receive half of the inheritance as a son. But in the context of the 7th century Arabia, much of the Quran's teaching is progressive. Remember us talking in that last lecture. It's not progressive by our terms today, but at that point, when a daughter might receive no inheritance, and they could have as many wives as you could afford, and we'll see here again in a moment, women had some inheritance rights here under Islam, whereas before they didn't, and they were granted certain protections under the divorce laws under Islam, such as they could retain the rights to controlling their own property, to controlling their own possessions, even if they did get a divorce. So in a world where, if a woman had property and they married and it became the property of the man, and if they divorced, she just had lost all of it and he kept all of it, that's a pretty good sized step forward for women and their rights. It was also made clear that female infanticide was something that Islam is going to forbid. So infanticide can take several different forms. It can take the unborn abortion form, but in the ancient world, especially in Rome, there was the practice of what's called exposure. And so if a couple had a girl and they couldn't afford the girl, but maybe they wanted a boy because a boy could help with work or be a soldier or whatever it was, whatever the reasoning might be, and girls were more of a liability and less of something that was giving you what you were looking for in a male-dominated world. You could take that baby girl out and basically lay her on the sidewalk and let the elements either kill her, or if someone came along and took mercy on the child, they could take her in. adopters, kind of the idea of leaving a baby on the doors, on the steps of a church, but obviously this is pre-Christianity that I'm talking about, and so it's not quite like that, but Muhammad's going to forbid this particular type of activity, and so we don't take baby girls out and commit infanticide towards them anymore. He says they have rights as well, and so you can't do that. Then also, he made it clear that men and women are equal in their relationship to God, and so again, that's a big step forward for the rights of women at that time. Today, it should be kept in mind that women, Muslim women, have been elected to lead the three most populous Muslim countries: Indonesia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And so that is also, again, a step forward for the rights of women here. So if all Muslim, yeah, we've already talked about that in that last lecture, so I'm going to hop forward here into the Hadith. All right, so just kind of gave you an idea a little bit about the structure, some of the content of the Quran. Didn't go into a lot of detail, kind of how it formed up, right? But not trying to do more than introduce you to it here. Now I want to introduce you to what's called the Hadith. Two primary ways that Muslims have responded to the message of the Quran are through legal interpretation based on the Hadith and the mystical movement of Sufism. And I'm not going to go into Sufism here, but I did want to give you an idea of the importance of and the content of the Hadith. Right. There is a tremendous challenge that Muslims face when it comes to the contents of the Quran, because it doesn't speak necessarily to regulating a very complex society and a very complex religion. So it's not going to deal with a lot of the day-to-day details, but instead is going to give you some of the major and main theology. So what is a Muslim to do when confronted with different types of day-to-day activities and how they should carry those out, because those rituals aren't necessarily laid out in the Quran? Remember that the Jews had the book of Leviticus, and that was incredibly detailed on how to carry out, say, ritual sacrifice, and the Quran is lacking that kind of detail as far as trying to live your daily life. And so what do? So with Jesus and the New Testament, and with the Jews and their sacred writings, those kinds of details are included in the Old Testament. But then with Jesus, what they do is they look a lot at his life and some of his teachings, and you can kind of figure out either through his actions or his words what you should do. But in the Quran, you don't hear Muhammad's voice, and so instead what started happening was that there were thousands and thousands of stories that were told about Muhammad and how he had behaved or what he had done or what he had said given a certain set of circumstances. So if there's a day-to-day question about what or how a certain procedure should be done, the Muslims then would tell the story, hey, my dad or my grandfather heard the Prophet say this, or heard Muhammad say, or saw Muhammad do that, right, in this circumstance. So those stories started being collected and passed around throughout the Muslim world. And so remember how quickly they conquered, and it's such a great distance. So the difficulty of trying to determine which of these stories were valid and therefore which of the actions Muhammad actually took or what words he actually said is going to be a difficult thing to figure out. So what happens is one fellow goes around and he begins to collect all of the different stories that are told about what the Prophet said or did, and he collected he interviewed 1,000 experts, and he heard 600,000 different stories, although some of those stories are just different versions of the same story. They might have some detailed differences, but if you've heard this one here, I can hear this. It's this story over here. Of those 600,000, he memorized 200,000, and of those 200,000 stories, he selected 2,700 that he thought were unquestionably authentic. So he was certain that these stories or actions were things that Muhammad did in fact say or do. So he takes those 2,700 and he publishes them in 97 different sections, and each one of these sections is going to deal with a different topic. And so this is the hadith forming up, right? Because it's all these stories about what the Prophet said or did. And so he publishes them in different sections according to topic. Some of the topics include things like faith, prayer, festivals, alms, as in almsgiving, sales, loans, gifts, war, marriage, good manners, as well as some of his comments on the Quran itself. So the hadith is the collection and publication of the actions or sayings of Muhammad that is going to help the readers and believers of Islam and the Quran to understand and to give them more to go on than just what's in the Quran. At least, hey, this is what the one that God revealed, the one through who God gave this revelation. This is what he said or did, and so we should follow his example. Is kind of the idea. All right. Now, of course, there's always going to be disagreement. There's going to be interpretations, and so as the hadith is discussed, remember the Jews talking about, and I said they are going to argue about everything. As the Jews are going to discuss and argue about some of their sacred texts here, we're also going to see that some of the hadith passages are going to be interpreted differently, and it's going to lead to 4 different schools of thinking. I don't want to go into a lot of depth here, but just to say, that interpretation is not just obvious and necessarily straightforward. There's disagreement, so there's argument, just like the Jews, and it's going to lead to some disagreement and some debate here as well as to which opinion is actually correct. But I remember that just to kind of give you a small example, and I don't know of any debate that necessarily takes place about this particular one, but just to kind of give you an idea of some of the content, there is a story about when Muhammad washes his hands before some type of ritual or prayer. In this case, I'm just going to say prayer. So the question is, which hand do you wash first? And so here we see his example is that he washed his left hand first, and so Muslims wash their left first and then their right, and it's part of what part of some of that comes out of this tradition of what he said and did, right? Now, that's kind of just a small example of what's happening here within this. Okay. All right. All right, that is a very, very brief introduction to the Hadith, but it kind of gives you an idea of what's happening and why, like how it formed and why it is important and is one of the sacred writings of Islam today. Obviously, it's not going to measure up with the Quran. The Quran is the one that matters the most. The Hadith just is going to be something that's helpful and still sacred, but not as sacred, obviously, as the Quran. So the last thing I want to introduce you to here is called the 5 pillars of Islam, and like the name suggests, these 5 things do hold up a lot of the rest of the Islamic faith, right? And it is one that I'm going to say all Muslims agree with, and that's probably not factual. There's probably somebody out there who's Muslim who did not agree necessarily with all this, but the idea here is that the overwhelming majority of Muslims think that these 5 things are correct and true, and these are the pillars of the faith for Muslims. Despite enormous religious, cultural, and political difference and divisions, all practicing Muslims accept and follow These 5 simple required observances described in the Quran. These pillars of Islam represent the quarter and common denominator that unite all Muslims and distinguish Islam from other religions. Following the pillars of Islam involves the Muslim's body, mind, time, energy, and meeting these obligations is required in order to continue on following the path of God and following God's will. These are things that God wants you to do, I'm going to say without exception. So the first pillar of Islam is called a declaration of faith. A Muslim is one who bears witness and who testifies that, quote, there is no God but God, or Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, end quote. Allah is the Arabic word for God, just as Yahweh is the Hebrew word for God that is used in the Old Testament. To become a Muslim, one need to only make this simple proclamation or confession of faith. So if you declare there is no God but God and Muhammad is the messenger of God, then and you actually believe it, then you are Muslim. So if you're Christian and you remember saying some kind of prayer of salvation or accepting Jesus into your heart or whatever you called it at that point, yeah, something like that, okay? This proclamation affirms Islam's absolute monotheism, the uncompromising belief in the oneness and unity of God, and association of everything else with God is idolatry, and that is the unforgivable sin. So you've got to believe in just that one God. The second part of the confession of faith asserts that Muhammad is not only a prophet, but is also a messenger of God, one to whom God has sent a book for that community of Muslims, and he is the vehicle for revelation, and that's it. It's final. There's not any other revelation. His is complete. All right. The second pillar of Islam is Muslim prayer. Muslims pray, or perhaps more correctly, worship 5 times a day. They worship at daybreak, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and evening. In many Muslim countries, reminders to pray or calls to prayer echo across the rooftops. If you see those minarets, that kind of tall, skinny tower somewhere in an Islamic city, and you hear kind of the melodious tune that comes rolling out across the top of the roofs. That's one of the calls to prayer. So the prayers consist of recitation of the Quran in Arabic and glorification to God, accompanied by standing, bowing, kneeling, touching the ground with one forehead, and sitting. And all of this is ritualistic and symbolic, or there's a reason behind all of the different rituals. And so if you are familiar with another religion and you're not with this one, think of if you're familiar with like a Catholic mass, and everybody knows when to stand up and when to kneel down and when to sit and when to speak and all that kind of stuff. It's the same type of idea here. Muslims can pray in any clean environment alone. They can pray together, pray in a mosque, at home, at work, on the road, indoors or outdoors, but it is preferable, they say, to pray together because it demonstrates equality and brotherhood and solidarity and all that stuff. But it can be done anywhere and in any condition. They pray facing Mecca, the city Mecca. And there are times when they don't have to pray. For example, if they're in battle, in the middle of a battle, and they, are fighting at the moment when they're supposed to say their noon prayer, they don't have to try to break off the battle and put their weapons down and pray. So there are times when they don't have to do that. There are exceptions that can be made, but if you can, you are certainly supposed to pray. All right. The third pillar of Islam is what's called a zakat, or a tithe, and it means purification. With this tithe, with this giving, you are expressing worship to God and thanksgiving to God, and then you're also helping to support the poor. It requires an annual contribution of 2.5% of an individual's wealth and assets, and so you're not just giving 10% of a paycheck here or there. or whenever you get it. But at the end of the year, you assess your total worth, and you give 2.5% of that total worth as this kind of tithe. It is not viewed as charity. It is an obligation to respond to the needs of those who are less fortunate members of the community. And it, again, also makes you thankful for what it is that God has given you as well. So it's a kind of worship here as well, not just supporting the poor, but as a form of worship. The fourth pillar of Islam is the fast of Ramadan, something that probably most of you have heard of and perhaps aren't really sure what it is, other than it's called a fast. It's just a kind of introduction to Ramadan here. It occurs once a year during the month of Ramadan, which is the 9th month of the Islamic calendar, in which the first revelation of Quran comes to Muhammad. So if you've ever wondered why you can't quite nail down the month in which Ramadan occurs, that's because they're on a different calendar and it moves around in the year. Okay. During this month, it is a month-long fast. During the month-long fast, Muslims whose wealth permits them to do so must abstain from food, drink, and sexual activity during the period from dawn to sunset. So you can't eat, drink, or have sex during the day, but at night, after the sun goes down, you do eat, drink, and sex is permitted as well. Fasting is not simply an act of self-denial. It is a discipline intended to stimulate religious reflection on human frailty and on the dependence of God. If you have ever been hungry, be that because you chose to fast or go on a diet, or whether it wasn't your choice, you've just been hungry because you didn't have food, you know how all-consuming it can be within your life. It is a constant tug on your consciousness to think about the act of eating. And so with fasting, especially here with this, or whether in any other kind of faith, any other kind of religious fasting, it is a constant reminder to meditate on what God has done or given, or what it is perhaps that God's sacrifice in the Christian world especially, and that you're following God's law here in the Islamic world, that you're trying to follow God's will. That constant kind of reminder, you really can't go very long without that kind of tapping you on the head. Hey, you're not eating, and the answer is yes, I'm doing it because I'm trying to be faithful to God, because I'm trying to follow God's path, because I'm trying to, whatever it might be, it's going to drum on your brain. And that's why people do this kind of religious fasting, because it's a time where they can go in and constantly have the memory of whatever it is that they're trying to remember for whatever religious reason. So that's why fasting. Many Muslims go to the mosque for the evening prayer, followed by special prayers recited only during Ramadan. Near the end of Ramadan, Muslims commemorate the Night of Power, when Muhammad first received God's revelation. The month ends with a major celebration that looks kind of like Christmas, because there's lots of there's a breaking of the fast, but then there's also a lot of joy involved, and even gift giving. So it's a huge part of the Muslim faith. It's that fourth pillar here, the fast of Ramadan. Okay, the fifth pillar of Islam is the pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. At least once in his or her lifetime, every adult Muslim who is physically and financially able is required to make this pilgrimage. So every year, about 2 million believers do travel from all over the world to the holy city of Mecca to form one community living in their faith. Those who participate in the pilgrimage wear simple garments. It symbolizes their purity and equality. You're not coming dressed up, in your Sunday best, so to speak, but you're coming in as one who is humble and, searching for the will of God. So the second major Muslim celebration and feast of sacrifice occurs here at the end of this pilgrimage. Yes. Also, finally, this is not the sixth pillar. It doesn't have any kind of official standing, but I wanted to include a little bit about it here because I think the idea of jihad gets misunderstood often. And so the sixth-ish pillar, it's not really an official pillar, it's just one that's something that that Muslims kind of contemplate, because there is a lesser and a greater jihad. The lesser jihad is the one where you go out and actually do battle with the enemies of Islam. And so if you're picking up a sword or a gun and literally going out and fighting against the enemies of Islam, that is lesser. The greater jihad means struggle. So the lesser struggle is physical battle. The greater jihad, the greater struggle, is the struggle that all people experience, where you struggle with your own self, you struggle with your own sins. So that I think is something that is important for especially non-Muslims to realize and to understand, is that much like if you are Christian or if you're Jew and you are contemplating trying to follow the will of God, and if you're trying to eliminate sinful activities in your life, you're struggling not just on a daily basis, but even on sometimes moment-to-moment basis or hour-to-hour, depending, I guess, on what you're doing. But you're struggling to constantly keep yourself pure, and the Muslims face the same type of activity where they're struggling against their own desires as well. And I think that's really important because they're trying to live a life of virtue just as people in other religions are trying to to live that life of virtue, and that is said to be the greater of the struggles that they're facing, because it is harder to defeat your own self and your own wants and desires and your own sin than it is to defeat an enemy with a sword or a gun. And it's a greater struggle, and one that quite honestly seems to never stop for any of us. So there we have. We've seen a little bit about the Quran, seen a little bit about the Hadith, and now the 5 or 6-ish pillars of Islam. Hopefully that gives you an idea of a little bit about their sacred text, and then also some about their theology and activities as a Muslim. All right. Thank you, and I will see you next time.